I had been planning the trip for 11 months. I want you to understand what 11 months means in the context of a life like mine. Not 11 months of casual browsing, not 11 months of saving a screenshot on my phone and calling it a plan. 11 months of a spreadsheet. 11 months of a dedicated savings account I had named, with the specific optimism of a woman who needed the naming to make it real mine. 11 months of reading every review, every forum thread, every travel blog entry written by anyone who had ever walked the streets I was going to walk, eaten in the restaurants I was going to eat in, stood in front of the things I had been wanting to stand in front of since I was 19 years old, and had seen a photograph in a magazine, and felt something shift in my chest that I had been carrying ever since. Italy, 3 weeks. Florence, Rome, the Amalfi Coast. I had never left the country. I want to say that plainly because it is the plainest and most important fact. I was 30 years old and I had never left the country, and I was going to leave the country in 22 days, and I had a confirmed itinerary and a passport that still had that new document smell, and a suitcase I had already packed and repacked twice, because packing is how I manage anticipation when anticipation becomes too large to simply sit with. My father Walter called on a Thursday evening. I almost didn't answer, not because I knew what was coming. I didn't know. Not specifically, though I had a general understanding of Walter's relationship to my plans, which was that my plans existed primarily as variables in the equation of what the family needed and were subject to revision whenever the family's needs reasserted themselves, which was often. I almost didn't answer because I was looking at photographs of the Amalfi Coast on my laptop, and I was happy, and I had learned over 30 years that Walter's calls and my happiness had an inverse relationship. But I answered. He said, "We need to talk about August." I said, "Okay." He said, "Your Aunt Helen is coming to stay with us for the last 2 weeks of August. You know, she needs help. Your mother can't do it alone." I said, "I'll be in Italy for the last 2 weeks of August." He said, "Then you'll need to cancel." Just like that. Not, "I know you have plans. Can we figure something else out?" Not, "Is there any flexibility in your dates? We have a situation." Just, "Then you'll need to cancel." The specific grammar of a man for whom his daughter's plans were a scheduling inconvenience rather than the carefully built, 11 months in the making, first international trip of her life reality that they were. I held the phone, and I looked at the Amalfi Coast on my laptop screen, and I breathed. "Dad," I said, "I have booked flights. I have booked hotels. I have a non-refundable itinerary that I have been saving for since last September. Deposits can be dealt with." He said, "Family comes first." Family comes first. I need to tell you about family comes first in Walter's household because it is the most important phrase in the vocabulary of my childhood, and it means something very specific when Walter says it, which is not what it sounds like it means. It sounds like it means that in a crisis, in a genuine emergency, the family pulls together and individuals sacrifice for the collective good. That is what it sounds like. What it means specifically in practice over 30 years of observation is this: Nicole cancels her thing. I had been canceling my things since I was 14 years old. I had canceled the school trip to Washington, D.C., because Walter decided that weekend was when we were repainting the garage, and my help was needed. I had canceled my college visit weekend to the university I most wanted to attend because Brenda had a scheduling conflict and needed me to watch Scott, who was 12 and entirely capable of existing in a house without supervision for 48 hours, but who was Scott, and therefore an exemption was made. I had canceled a concert I had bought tickets to 6 months in advance because Walter's brother was visiting unexpectedly and the house needed to look a certain way, and I was the person whose presence in the house contributed to it looking that way. I had not canceled my birthday, technically, but I had spent 4 of the last 7 birthdays doing something that was primarily for someone else's convenience, which is its own kind of cancellation. The Italy trip had been planned, in part, because I was 30, because 30 felt like a line, not a crisis, not a midlife moment, just a clarity, a clear-eyed understanding that if I did not go specifically, deliberately, with my passport and my spreadsheet and my account named mine and my packed and repacked suitcase, I would be 40 and still having this conversation. Still being the variable in Walter's equation. Still canceling my things. I said, "Dad, I'm not canceling." Silence. It was a specific kind of silence. The silence Walter produced when he had said a thing he expected to be the final word and had encountered resistance in a direction he had not prepared for. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm not canceling the trip," I said. "I have a passport and a confirmed itinerary, and I leave in 22 days. I am 30 years old. I have been planning this for 11 months. Your aunt needs. I understand that Aunt Helen needs care." I said, "I am sorry that her situation is difficult. I am also not the solution to it. I am a woman who saved for a year to take a trip she has wanted since she was 19, and I am going." He said, "If you get on that plane, you can consider yourself unwelcome at this table until further notice." Until further notice. The formal language of a man delivering an ultimatum he believed would work because it had always worked, because 30 years of Nicole cancels her thing had taught him that the threat of exclusion from the family table was the most reliable instrument in his collection, because he had never once had to follow through on it, because the threat had always been sufficient. I said, "Okay." He said, "Okay? That's all you have to say?" "I'm going to Italy, Dad." I said, "We can talk when I get back." I hung up. I sat in the specific silence of a woman who has just done something irreversible and is in the moment between the doing and the understanding of what the doing means. My hands were steady. This surprised me. I had expected them to shake, had expected the physical manifestation of the fear that had lived in me for 30 years around Walter's disapproval. The fear that had been the engine of the cancellations, the fear that family comes first, had been weaponized against since I was 14 years old. My hands were steady. I looked at the Amalfi Coast on my laptop. Then I called Tara. Tara had been my best friend since college, and was the person I called when I needed to think out loud in the presence of someone who would neither catastrophize nor minimize, but would simply be present and accurate. She answered on the second ring, and I told her what had happened, and there was a pause, and then she said, "Did your hands shake?" "No," I said. "Then you already know," she said. I already knew. I did not cancel the trip. But I did something else that Thursday evening that I had not planned on doing, and that arrived not as a strategy. I want to be clear about that. It arrived not as a plan, but as a thought I had while I was looking at the Amalfi Coast, a thought that came from the specific place where anger and love coexist in complicated people, which is to say it came from the part of me that was furious at Walter and still, underneath the furious, loved my family with the exhausting persistence of a woman who had spent 30 years loving people who did not always make it easy. The thought was, what if I took them with me? Not all of them. Not Aunt Helen, who needed care and could not travel, and not in place of the trip I had planned, not as a compromise, not as the cancellation wearing different clothes, but the trip I had planned, extended by 4 days at the beginning, with flights for Walter and Brenda and Scott added to the itinerary, with a hotel room booked for them in Florence where the trip would begin, with 4 days of Italy that my family had never seen any more than I had seen it, offered not as an apology, and not as a bargain, and not as a peace offering, but as the thing it actually was, the action of a woman who loved her family, and who was also going to Italy. Both things. At the same time. I called Greg. Greg was the travel agent I had worked with for the entire 11 months of planning, a meticulous, patient man who had the specific gift of understanding what a trip meant to the person taking it and planning accordingly. He had my entire itinerary in his system. I told him what I was thinking. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You want to add 3 people and extend by 4 days?" "Yes," I said. "And the upgrades?" I had not said upgrades yet. "Yes," I said. "Business class for all of us. And the hotel in Florence, upgrade that to a suite." There was a longer pause. "Nicole," Greg said carefully, "are you sure about this?" "Yes," I said, "because what you're describing is—" "I know what it is," I said. "I've been saving for a year. I have more than enough. I want to do this." He booked it. "I want to tell you about the money because the money is part of the story, and I have never been someone who discusses money casually, but this is not a casual discussion. I had saved more than the trip required, saved with the specific thoroughness of someone who did not want budget anxiety to live anywhere in her 3 weeks in Italy, who wanted the trip to be what the trip was supposed to be, fully and without compromise. The account named mine had more than the flights and the hotels and the itinerary required. The upgrades cost money, I had. The additional 4 days and 3 extra people cost money, I had. I had the money because I had made the decisions that produced the money, the decade of working carefully, of living within my means, of the specific financial discipline of someone who knew that nobody was going to build her future for her, and had built it accordingly. And I had the money because I had never, not once in 11 months, touched the account named mine for anything other than Italy. I sent Walter a text, not a call. I had said what I needed to say on the call, and the call was over. I sent a text with the booking confirmation attached, and a single sentence that said, "I've added flights and a hotel for you, Mom, and Scott for the first 4 days. Business class. Florence. I leave August 3rd. You're booked on the same flight." I put my phone face down on the desk. I went back to my laptop. I looked at the Amalfi Coast. The phone buzzed 4 times in the next 20 minutes. I did not look at it for an hour. When I finally turned it over, there were 2 missed calls from Brenda, 1 from Scott, and a text from Walter that said, "What is this?" Not a question mark. A period. What is this? The statement of a man who had issued an ultimatum and received a business class ticket to Florence in response, and was not sure what grammatical punctuation to put on his confusion. I called Brenda. She answered immediately with the voice she used when she was managing her own excitement, while also trying to figure out what she was supposed to feel about the situation, which was a complicated voice because the situation was complicated. She said, "Nicole, is this real?" "Yes," I said. "You booked us. Business class. You and Dad and Scott. Florence for 4 days, and then you fly home, and I continue the itinerary." "But your father said—" "I know what he said." I said, "I'm going to Italy, Mom, and I'd like my family to see Florence. If you don't want to come, you don't have to." She made a sound that was not quite a sentence. The sound of a woman recalibrating. "He said you'd hung up on him." She said, "I finished the conversation." I said, "Another sound. Scott is already looking up what to eat in Florence." She said. I laughed. Scott was 26 and had the specific enthusiasm for food that had been his defining characteristic since childhood, the brother who read menus the way other people read novels, who had opinions about regional cuisines, and who had been under Walter's roof for 26 years, the person I loved most uncomplicatedly in my family. Scott had not created the dynamic. Scott had simply lived inside it. elevated by proximity to Walter's certainty the way younger children are elevated when parents need someone to direct their investment, and I held that separately from my love for him because the distinction mattered. "Tell Scott the Bistecca in Florence," I said. "He'll understand." I hung up. Walter called an hour later. His voice had a quality I had not heard from him before, not the flat certainty of the ultimatum, and not the managed warmth he used in social situations. Something in between. Something that was finding its way toward a thing he did not have a ready script for. He said, "You didn't have to do this." "No," I said. "I didn't. This must have cost." "It did," I said. "I had it." Silence. "You saved all this, and you're spending it on my family," I said, "and on myself, at the same time. Both things." He was quiet for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "Your mother has been on the travel website for the last 40 minutes. I said, "The Uffizi Gallery is booked in advance. Tell her I'll add the tickets to the itinerary." Another silence. "I was wrong," he said, "to say what I said about the table. Not an apology, exactly. Not the full reckoning I would have written for him if I were writing his lines. But the direction of it, the acknowledgment, the naming of the thing as wrong rather than finding a way to reframe it into something that wasn't wrong. From Walter, who had not named his own things as wrong in my memory, this was not nothing. "I know," I said. Nicole, I didn't know you had." "You didn't ask," I said. "You haven't asked about my finances or my savings or what I've been building for years. Because you've been assuming. And the assumptions were wrong." He breathed. "Yes," he said. "They were." I let that land. I let it be what it was, incomplete and real. And the furthest Walter had traveled in the direction of seeing me accurately in 30 years, and I was not going to diminish it by demanding it be further or dismiss it by pretending it was enough. It was what it was. A start. A man at the edge of a new map. "Pack comfortable shoes," I said. "Florence's cobblestones." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. We flew out August 3rd. All four of us in the same cabin, in the wide seats that I had chosen, because if I was going to Italy for the first time, I was going in comfort, and if my family was coming for the first 4 days, they were going in comfort too, in the specific extravagance of a woman who had earned the extravagance and was not going to apologize for it. Scott fell asleep before we were over the Atlantic, and Brenda watched the flight map with the focused attention of someone experiencing the miracle of being in the air over an ocean for the first time, and not wanting to miss the moment the map showed them crossing from one side of the world to the other. Walter sat beside me for a while in a silence that was different from his usual silences, not managed, not waiting for the conversation to reorient itself in his favor. Just quiet. The quiet of a man sitting next to a daughter he had been consistently wrong about, and who had bought him a business-class ticket to Florence anyway, and who was looking out the window at the dark above the Atlantic with the expression of someone who has waited 11 months for this, and is finally, completely inside it. He said, "At some point over the ocean, not to me exactly, more to the window, Aunt Helen, we should have figured something else out." I looked at him. "We'll figure it out when we get back," I said. He looked at me. I held his gaze. "Yeah," he said. "We will." Florence was everything. I cannot tell you Florence in a way that fits inside the sentences available to me. I can tell you the specific color of the light at 7 in the morning when I walked to the Arno before anyone else was awake, the specific weight of standing in front of Botticelli and understanding, finally, in my body, rather than my mind, what the word masterpiece actually meant. I can tell you Scott eating the bistecca with the expression of a man encountering confirmation of something he had always believed but never proven, I can tell you Brenda, at the Uffizi with tears on her face in front of a painting she had not known she was going to cry at. I can tell you Walter. Walter on the last evening in Florence, the evening before they flew home, and I continued the itinerary, at a restaurant I had booked for the four of us, with wine that was correct for the region and food that was correct for the season, and the specific light of a Florentine evening that makes everything look like a painting because the city has been being painted for 600 years, and the light has not changed. He raised his glass. He said, "And I want to tell you," he said this simply and without performance, in the voice of a man who was not accustomed to this kind of sentence, but who was saying it anyway, to Nicole, who planned all of this, who knew what she was doing before any of us gave her credit for knowing. Scott said, "Here, here." Brenda had the expression she had had at the Uffizi. I picked up my glass. I did not make a speech. I did not respond with everything I could have responded with: the 14-year-old in the garage, the canceled concerts, the ultimatum on a Thursday in July, the 30 years of being the variable in someone else's equation. I did not say any of it because the evening was beautiful and the wine was right, and my family was around a table in Florence that I had put them at, and the saying of all of it could wait for a different evening in a different city where the light was not doing what Florentine light did at 8 o'clock in July. I said, "Thank you for coming." And I meant it. They flew home the next morning. I stood outside the restaurant after breakfast, and I watched the taxi take them to the airport, and then I stood on a cobblestone street in Florence with my bag and my passport and 14 more days of Italy ahead of me, and I felt the specific, clean, enormous feeling of a woman who is exactly where she decided to be, not where she was permitted to be, not where she was told she could be, where she decided. I walked to the Arno. The light was doing its morning thing, that specific gold that I had read about in 11 months of research, and that the reading had not prepared me for, because some things cannot be prepared for and can only be stood inside when they are finally real. I stood inside it, 30 years old, first time out of the country, passport in my bag, with 14 days left of stamps it had not received yet. I thought about the account named mine. I thought about a Thursday evening and an ultimatum, and my hands not shaking. I thought about business class and cobblestones, and the Bistecca and Brenda at the Uffizi, and Walter raising a glass in the Florentine evening, and saying the thing he had not said in 30 years. I thought about what 11 months of wanting something and building toward it and refusing to cancel it had produced, which was this morning, this river, this light, mine, all of it mine, and I had not had to cancel a single thing to have it, not one single thing.